Great. So, from what I can see on my screen is that we have a maximum percentage of people who don't know much about the topic but are curious to know more. We have a few who have read a little about it but are curious to know more. And some have studied this and wish to pursue it further, but none are working professionals in this particular field. So that tells us a little about the crowd that we have. And I think it's a very, very interesting mix of attendees. So again, on behalf of Team ISF, I welcome you all to day 7 of India Science Month Online, India's largest virtual science fest. And at this point, I would request our guest, Professor Sunetra Gupta, to kindly turn her video and audio on, for we will now be beginning with the interview. Professor Gupta, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you at our festival here today.
Thank you very much for asking me.
I'd just like to tell all our attendees that Professor Gupta is a theoretical epidemiologist at Oxford University, and she's a prolific writer and has made a mark for herself in the field of literature too. She's a very well-known, multifaceted scientist, and it is it's such an honor for us to have Professor Gupta at our festival here today. Professor Gupta, I do know that this is a very, very busy time for you. So thank you for taking the time out for doing this for us.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, so like I mentioned in my introduction, ma'am, you have dabbled in so many different fields, and we're going to cover all about it today. I'd like to ask you, so I read a little about you, and I know that you were born and brought up in Calcutta, and that you have started your career in writing by translating Tagore's work. So I want to know what sort of influence Rabindranath Tagore had on while you were growing up and inspired you in the field of literature.
Well, Tagore has a huge influence on the Bengali culture, as well as, of course, many other cultures, not just in India. But in Bengal, his influence is very, very huge and all pervasive. And in some ways, actually, my first book, Memories of Rain, was to an extent a little bit of a critique of that, in that there is something very interesting about a culture that flowers so much under the dominance of a single poet. That is not, of course, to say that there weren't, or in fact, what is important to note is there, of course, there's the literature scene the tradition, literary tradition, if you like, of Bengal, which is not old because it's a new culture and a new language by many standards, that it, of course, contains many other luminaries, and they had a huge amount of influence on me, including, for example, the Bengali modernists. Tagore himself was a modernist, of course, as well, but he had a huge, his span is so huge that was not the only thing he did. But so how does Tagore influence daily life in Calcutta? Tagore's songs are almost part of the matrix of life in Bengal. So, you wake up listening to Tagore songs. I was very privileged to have a father who sang Tagore songs extremely well, semi-professionally. So I was surrounded by the music of Tagore, but then, of course, his various other literary works and his art, his painting, and just the ethos that he created for Bengali life was very fundamental to my existence. But I was also taught by my father himself and the milieu that I grew up in to also critique it, to not take it as an unqualified thing. And yet, I remember when I was a child, I used to think, because Thakur means Lord, of course, that Rabindranath Tagore was just another of the Thakurs, like Loki Thakur, Saraswati Thakur, and he sat on a cloud and wrote songs and just sort of tossed them down to earth. So that's how I, that was the extent that I think captures the influence that he had. But I was also taught to be critical of his writings, and
Right.
as I get
Like you
older.
mentioned, I mean, Tagore has a very huge influence in Indian culture, especially in Bengal. I'd like to know how you started off by translating his work. How did that come about?
Well, actually, that goes right back to the previous question, which is that because I grew up with my father singing Tagore songs, and actually I also learnt some from him and got some music tuition as well. So singing Tagore songs, although I never did it very well, was also part of my life. But it was very, very central to my life, Tagore songs. And when I was writing my first novel, Memories of Rain, I had a tape, one of those cassette tapes of my father's songs, and I played them all the time. I played them all the time anyway, but certainly while I was writing the book, I was playing my father's songs, and I found myself kind of translating them in a very loose way, because I wasn't, I wasn't trying to write a book, the definitive translation. But as I was writing, the songs sort of permeated the text, and also because it was fiction, I didn't have that sort of imperative to translate them in any particular rigorous way. I just did it in a very loose style. So that's how I started to translate Tagore songs. Later, when I was actually asked to do a particular song or a prose piece, obviously I approached it in a slightly different way, but that's how it all started.
Oh, all right. That sounds really interesting, because I did read about how much the poetry influenced you. And, I do know that you also write a lot of poetry, which brings me to my next question, that you've received a lot of awards for your work in fiction. And I'd like to tell our attendees that Professor Gupta has also won the prestigious Sahitya Academy Award. And, Professor Gupta also was the judge of one of our science fiction writing competitions, and that has worked out really great, and we've received some wonderful entries for the same. I'd like to ask you what your personal take is on how, we say that science fiction can often be futuristic in its vision. We also think about how fiction influences science, how science influences fiction. So, what would your thoughts be on the same, as a scientist as well as a writer in fiction?
On science fiction as a genre, would
Yeah,
you like to
yeah,
comment? Well, in fact, the first pieces that I ever published were short stories, and short to mid-length stories, which were science fiction. They were written in Bengali in the early 80s. And at the time, I felt that science fiction was a perfect vehicle for sort of my interests in both science and literature. But actually, of course, science fiction is much more than that. It's a kind of, it's a very interesting way of exploring realities. I mean, it's a form of fiction that allows you to be imaginative in a particular direction. So it's like, in some ways, it's a cousin of surrealism. It takes reality and wrenches it in a particular direction. So I found that to be very, very exciting. I read a lot of science fiction when I was in school. And so I really liked the genre. And I still think some of some of my favorite authors are science fiction, or I mean, someone like Ray Bradbury is almost writing something you might call science fantasy. But then, of course, there is that other genre of science fiction, which is a bit cultish and formulaic, which isn't the kind that I particularly like.
True. Okay. So I think it'll be useful for our attendees to know who were your favorite science fiction authors, and what aspect about their writing particularly inspired you.
Well, I mean, Stanislaw Lem or Philip K. Dick, as I mentioned, Ray Bradbury, even though he's not really science fiction, is more of a science fantasy, right? And as I said, the way that, I guess the point is that when you're writing fiction that is not realistic fiction, you face a problem, which is that once reality itself serves as a constraint, because when you write, you can't write completely without constraints. So unless you have some constraints, you won't find the right kind of balance between order and chaos that you want in your writing. So, sorry, I'm so sorry. I don't know why the phone is ringing. It shouldn't be ringing. So I'm sorry about that.
Hello, we are not available now. Please leave your name and phone number after the beep.
Sorry, really sorry about that.
No problem.
So when you stray outside of just plain realism, you have to have some kind of boundary or some kind of guiding force that allows you to exploit the potential of what you're doing in a directed way. And so science fiction is great because you are going outside reality, which is a great way to use your imagination to actually make sense of reality. But that it is guided by science as we know it, or certain principles of science, gives it also a kind of boundary. So you can work within those boundaries, and it's a good way of marrying the intellectual energy, your intellectual and emotional energies, because intellectually you're very, very, constrained in some ways by writing. You have to fulfill the conditions of whatever scientific principle or whatever it is, universe that you've decided to construct. So, but at the same time, you can invest it with emotion. So it's the best kind of collision between emotion and reason.
Absolutely. You mentioned about the boundaries. I think that's a very interesting takeaway, because science fiction in general, it stretches beyond all boundaries. It allows you to really, explore what isn't already there. And science fiction, speculative fiction, again, both of these, you can let your imagination flow free, and you're not bound by particular rules. Which brings me to my next question. Would you say that in science fiction, scientific elements need to be accurate, whereas the fantasy bit may flow freely? So how does one strike a balance as far as science fiction is concerned?
That's really an excellent question, because that is the fundamental problem, I think, of writing science fiction. And you can do it in various ways. Obviously, there are lots of answers. So you could be, you could be rigorous about the science, so that everything you do, so that itself creates some sort of poetic energy, because you're being really rigorous about science. So everything you do bounces off that rigor. But at the same time, like Ray Bradbury, you could also take liberties with the science. And in that case, you are guided by other aesthetic principles, and you're just simply using some kind of conceit that arises out of a kind of futuristic vision, perhaps, that you're just exploiting that. But your boundaries are essentially aesthetic, rather than, or arise out of the considerations of what a literary form should be. Whereas when but you can do it the other way, where you set the science to be the boundary. And one person who does that, for example, the two people who do that well, but don't achieve, for me, literary status, are Isaac Asimov. So I love his stories, but they're not they're not literary, they're wonderful intellectual experiments. And Arthur C. Clarke, of course. And then, of course, the raw material there can be exploited in a different way. So while Arthur C. Clarke, 2001: A Space Odyssey is a bit of a rambling book, but then Stanley Kubrick turned it into this incredible film. So it's all a matter of interacting with different ideas and thinking about, as you just said, what isn't already there. I think that's a really nice way to put it.
I think it's very interesting that you brought out the point of the conversion of that book into a film, because that brings me to my next question. What is your take on the representation of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, STEM in general, in literature, and cinema? How do you think it has evolved over the years, and how do you think is the current portrayal of STEM in cinema and literature?
Well, that's a very tricky question, actually. I don't know whether I'll be able to answer it well, partly because I don't really have a very good handle on current representations of science. I mean, obviously, I have watched and continue to watch. I was and continue to be a big fan of cinema. Cinema is I'm very interested in cinema, and in fact, for a very long time, as a child, I wanted to be a film director rather than any of the things I am now. But so cinema plays a very important role in my life. But I tend to go back and watch old films rather than look at what's happening now. Among films that I've watched recently, and they're not that recent, but that I was very impressed by, there was the film Gattaca, which I found very, I thought used the concept of being identified by your genes in a very productive way. And the tension that arises then by what your genetic code specifies and what you feel you are capable of doing. And if a society becomes completely enslaved or becomes slave to just what's written in your genes, then of course other potential ways of, other forms of potential become completely neglected, and so one of the characters in there is someone who doesn't have the right genes to go to space, but then he finds a way to do it because he just has the will. So that I think was a good exploitation of that. And then there are, of course, some of the futurist films are really sumptuous and beautiful and visually in how they bring the future to the screen. So I think there are many ways in which that genre as such has been successfully used. As to the portrayal of science and scientists, that's always tricky because, how do you portray a scientist? I mean, maybe the most important thing is for that to be sort of incidental rather than a part of, the defining feature. So, but that's typically not the case. But I'm thinking of the film Contagion, which as such is a reasonable film. Nothing, it doesn't hit any of my top categories, but it's also not offensive, and it's very much in my area of research. But I thought the way the epidemiologists were portrayed there was really quite positive. So I think most portrayals now are quite positive, and there's obviously a concerted effort to bring women into those roles. So portray them, your epidemiologist as a woman, or the main vaccinologist as a woman, or something. That's the physicist as a woman, which is laudable, and sometimes also creates an interesting character. The artistic potential of such a propositions also often, I think, exploited well.
No, absolutely, because cinema does play a very important part in the way we perceive a lot of things in our day-to-day life. And it's interesting that you spoke about representation, because that brings me to my next question. The bias that exists in STEM, in the field of science, it's a much spoken about topic, and there's a lot being said about it, and there is so much being done about it. But do you believe that there need to be more concerted efforts in the field to get more women in STEM, to increase representation? And I would like to know, if so, how exactly could we go about it? What are some concrete steps that you think, as a woman in STEM, you would like to see in the future ahead to increase representation?
So I think the most important element that's been actually widely ignored is that we need to create, move away from what has become increasingly a kind of a competitive, capitalistic mode of conducting science. So science has become all about big money, big grants, competition. It's a really it's a very vicious kind of landscape compared to when I entered science, 35 years ago. It was not like that. I mean, there were lots of faults with it. There was a lot of people would just kind of sit there and do nothing. It wasn't necessarily as efficient as it could be, but it was a kind of a space that was created by society for people to be in, to think, to contribute in ways that weren't necessarily tangible. Whereas now the directive is you've got to produce, you've got to justify your existence, and the focus is on impact and tangible impact. Now, I say this as someone who is currently working on a flu vaccine, which has been licensed which arose out of a mathematical model and has now been licensed to a company and is being developed as part of that. So that's a tangible process. So I'm not against tangible outcomes. I just don't think that's why we should be doing science. I didn't set out to make a flu vaccine. I set out to try and understand how influenza evolves. But there is a huge influence on impact and on metrics of success. Why do I think that's problematic? I think that by and large, women still have a whole range of responsibilities, more than men. And in any case, what I'm about to say just applies to everyone. What we want to do is create a level playing field. We don't want women to be disadvantaged because they are bringing up children, which in this country is the main reason, and for me, I would say, was the main problem I encountered in being a scientist, was that it's very difficult to combine looking after children with science. And paradoxically, I would say I still say to people that when I was growing up in Calcutta, I never for once thought, oh, I'm a woman, I shouldn't be a scientist, so how am I going to be a scientist and a mother and a wife, or all of that? Never crossed my mind, because among my aunts, some people worked, some didn't. One of them was the head of a cancer institute. All of this was enabled by having a network of people. So children weren't the sole responsibility of one person, the mother. So I think we actually have a much better setup in India for women to go out and try and fulfill their dreams. So here, I think what we need is to provide that network. I mean, provide the support for children to be looked after, because that is, I think, the primary, or other people that you have caring responsibility. I mean, if you're a carer of an elderly person, all of these things really become an impediment, and it's magnified in a climate where not being able to go to conference or not being able to write that extra grant really, really sets you back. So I think that right now with regard to women, there is this idea that there's an unconscious bias against women, and of course there is, but that's the main reason why women are being held back. But I don't think that's true. I think the main reason women are being held back, and anyone who has other responsibilities finds it difficult in science, is because the environment is competitive in a way that's not productive for anybody.
Right. That does make a lot of sense, because like you mentioned, it does become very restrictive, because it always becomes, it's like you have to choose between one or the two, and then that creates, that becomes difficult in order to advance ahead in science or any other career for that matter. But would you say that over the years you have personally seen the bias reduce, or do you think that it has been stagnant, or do you think it's only increased? What has your experience in the past few years been?
So I have had very little personal experience of bias. I very rarely, maybe it's just because I choose to ignore it, but I've very rarely felt that, the reason I'm not being taken seriously is because I'm a woman. I've had to face a lot of challenges in my career, including right now with the coronavirus pandemic and my analysis of it. But I think a lot of that resistance in my life has come from being saying something that goes against the orthodoxy, rather than because I'm a woman. In fact, I think at this point, a woman who is compliant with the orthodoxy is often championed and given, because it's in the interests of people, men and other women alike, to have such people in positions of power. So I don't think that that's an issue. Having said that, in the last few months, the resistance that I've met with has, for the first time in my life, made me wonder whether someone would write to me in those specific terms had I been a male colleague of theirs. So, I mean, it's there, obviously, but I think the main thing that's changed, which is really problematic for women, is this emphasis on achievement of a kind that is practical and tangible, and this emphasis on getting grants and on fast commoditization of science, basically, has become, I think, the main enemy.
You spoke about the pandemic, and how it has really, it's really changed lives for so many people, and you've been obviously working over the past few months on so many different aspects of the pandemic. I know that you've also written a book on pandemic. And as an expert in public health, well, now we are hopefully edging towards, with the vaccine coming out, we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic soon. But as the years go ahead, we know that there is something new that will come up soon. There will be another pandemic. There will be another plague. What do you think are our key learnings as a society from this pandemic? And do you think our learnings from this one have prepared us for the next big thing to come?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert in public health, and I say this, I'm not saying that means I can't have an opinion, but I think it's important to say that, because I think one of the problems we've had, I can't see you anymore. Are you still there?
Hi. I'm here. Yeah, I'm just here. It's a bit of a connection problem.
Okay, don't worry.
Please continue.
I was just emphasizing the fact that my expertise is in sort of the biology of disease and the epidemiology, particularly the mathematical aspects of the theoretical aspects of how it spreads. So but I do have opinions on the public health issue as such as well. And I'm saying this because I think one of the problems we've had is that we have a bunch of people who are not experts, who, for example, there are people who are experts in public health, but have no understanding of the population dynamics of the virus, who have been, as I said, handed the microphone to talk about these things. And I think that's caused a real disaster. So what do I think we should, in terms of what pandemics, obviously I have certain ideas. They mainly arise from my experience in immunology and theoretical epidemiology. So I think that what we can expect, so what I have to say is essentially good news. I think that generally speaking, most viruses that pop up are ones that are cousins of things that are circulating already. So this coronavirus is just a cousin of the 4 other coronaviruses that are seasonally circulating. And what that means is that we usually have, for most things that will arise in the future, we will have some form of immunity to protect us against death, if not infection. And that has turned out to be true with this virus, that because we have had exposure to the other viruses, the other coronaviruses, most of us aren't dying from it at all. And there are some people who are in fact able to resist infection even. So, and the rest of us, when we get infected, don't get too ill enough to die. So that's, I think, the general picture, which is why we should stop being so scared that something will come which is truly, going to decimate the entire population. But then the other thing we need, having said that, we also, clearly this new virus is claiming a number of lives, because there are people who have never had it before, who are in a phase of their life where they are vulnerable, either because they're old or because they have some form of what we call a comorbidity. They're diabetic or they have heart disease. So, it is, or asthma. So it's really problematic in that regard. So what we need to do is prepare ourselves. We need to have, and particularly the countries that have those resources, like the United Kingdom, it's shocking how woefully unprepared the United Kingdom was for this pandemic. So right now, people are panicking like mad because the hospitals are filling up. There aren't enough people around to look after those who are ill. And it's a real crisis. There's a crisis in the National Health Service. Now, I hate to say, I don't think it's okay for me to say, well, every country therefore should have that capacity. This country clearly could have boosted its capacity to deal with this problem, especially over the summer when the virus was at low levels. So that's one thing, but then there are many countries in the world who don't have those resources. And of course, all I can say in that regard is I think there should be much more investment in the health infrastructure of developing countries. So, I think much of what we're seeing is a problem of the disgraceful level of inequality globally in wealth and the resources available to different people. So that's something that hopefully I don't know whether this will be a lesson. So if you don't have the right infrastructure to deliver the healthcare that is necessary to keep people who are inevitably going to get ill during an epidemic or pandemic, then you will start making decisions which in the long run could have worse consequences. So that's one thing that I think should happen. But then I also think this pandemic has been portrayed, the narrative surrounding it has not been one that is conducive to saving people's lives. So, for example, myself and a group of other people suggested that the best way to deal with this pandemic, because it only affects those who are a certain group of people, is to shield those people and try and not to impose other measures on the rest of the population, because that has very significant collateral damage. And that idea was, instead of being accepted as a potential solution, it was dismissed on political grounds, which is really problematic. So hopefully in the next iteration of this sort of an event, the politics will be managed better. At the moment, it's really shocking how the politics are interfering with what should be a healthy, robust debate on what is actually going on, for starters. So there's no agreement on what is going on, and that there are profound misunderstandings about how the whole system works. And then there is any attempt to question the mainstream narrative is being dealt with in a very reprehensible way. I can't hear you.
Right. Oh, yeah. So I do think that you pointed out a lot of different areas of science in what you just said. So, there's epidemiology. When you're dealing with a pandemic, there are so many different forces that come together. So there's epidemiology, statistics, mathematics. There's also taking care of human rights while you're dealing with a pandemic. We have biology coming into place. We are looking at AI and robotics and how technology can actually help us save more people, reduce the work done by manpower. So I would like to know your take on how the future 5 to 10 years are going to look for interdisciplinary or collaborative studies. How do you think science is going to evolve in the coming few years with respect to different streams of science coming together?
Well, I hope that in fact has been an encouraging trend in the time that I've been in science, that different disciplines have started to really take on board the value of proper interdisciplinarity. So, there was a drive towards interdisciplinarity, that's been ongoing probably for the last 50 years or so, but it was, early efforts were often sort of forced, like, let's put a chemist and a botanist together and see what they come up with. Whereas actually the interdisciplinarity should be suggested by the problem. It should be led by the problem that you're looking at. So, for example, in our journey towards a flu vaccine, it started with a mathematical model, and then we started doing the immunology. Then I hired a postdoc, Craig Thompson, who was a biochemist. So he brought to it the knowledge of structural biology and chemistry. And then now we are working with vaccinologists to make the actual product, to translate it from that original idea, which was really kind of an epidemiological evolutionary biologist. That was in the realm of sort of evolutionary biology, really. But out of that, it's now hopefully moving towards being something on a shelf that will save lives. So, but to make that whole journey, it requires and benefits from input from various disciplines. But I think the timeline itself is what those interactions should be anchored to, rather than, oh, let's see what happens when we stick two people together from different fields. Having said that, it is always a good idea to have people from different fields talking to each other, because that's does often lead to serendipitous sort of ideas and connections, and is also just part of the excitement of science itself.
Do you think that the idea of different streams of science coming together in an to foster interdisciplinary sciences, did it at any point of time excite you in your career, that steered you towards epidemiology? Were there different aspects of it that appealed to you?
Yeah, well, I actually started off, my interest in science was sparked by my interest really in, to start, there were two different branches, if you like. I always liked natural history. Who doesn't? I mean, you know, animals and how they work, and plants and whatnot. So that was always a kind of interest, animal behavior in particular. But I was also fascinated by physics, the beauty of mathematics and physics. So, so my original plan was actually to study physics, but then I realized you could use mathematics to understand biological systems, and that really sort of seemed to me the perfect thing to do. And so, yes, I started off with that sort of interdisciplinarity. It became the natural thing. But of course, in that regard, I was very fortunate to have gone to university at Princeton, where the curriculum was a liberal arts curriculum. So there was the option to move between fields, to combine a lot of different courses. So although I graduated with a degree in biology, half the courses I took were in mathematics, because that's what I needed in order to develop into a mathematical biologist. So yeah, we need to think, and I know there are lots of universities in India who are, I think there is a lot of thought going into that process of, you know, how to move out of the sort of monolithic, you are studying botany and that's all, from that.
Oh, yeah, I do agree that there's a lot being done in India for the same, but we do have a long way to go to. But like you said,
I mean, much more than in the UK, let's put it that way.
yeah, no, I do think, like you said, the restrictive methods of, for example, like you said, if you have chosen botany, you have to do botany ahead. Then there's so much more to explore, and I think as students study and tend to get into the profession of working in sciences, you tend to realize how much more there is to than just what you have done till that point of time. So, I would like to know, in speaking of, pandemics and your work in vaccine, you see, in the US there are a lot of anti-vaccine theories. We have so many people who don't want to get vaccinated. I would like to know, as a scientist, what would your take on this be? And I mean, how? I guess at this point of time, it's important that more scientists talk to society, engage with the public, and tell them why it's important. So, what would your take on the same be?
Yeah, I mean, I've never quite understood anti-vaccination sentiments, because, we have a lot of proof that many vaccines work. And the way in which vaccines work is not just to protect the individual, but also the community. So that's one of the reasons why I think certain vaccines could easily be made mandatory, like measles, where you know there is a proven benefit to both the individual and society. So it's extremely unfortunate indeed that people would reject that, and on the basis of some theory that was promoted, as you know, over 20 years ago, that measles causes autism, and those things are incredibly damaging and do result in the deaths of people who shouldn't have died. So that's one side of the anti-vax argument, which is bewildering, but it's also, it shows you that there is this problem that people will act in their individual interests. So even sane and rational people will be acting to promote their own individual interests. So it's a tricky problem, but the converse, though, is also something that I'm now observing with regard to the coronavirus vaccine, because it's wonderful news that we have this vaccine or range of vaccines. We know for most of them that they protect you against disease and death. We don't know that they protect against infection or further transmission.
Yeah.
So the sensible way, in my mind, to use that vaccine is to protect those who are vulnerable and not vaccinate those who are not vulnerable. Because there is, not only is there no individual benefit to those people who are not vulnerable, but also as a sustainable strategy, it's better to have a combination of vaccination and immunity, naturally acquired immunity in the population. These can act synergistically to provide a sustainable strategy to minimize deaths. Whereas if we try and vaccinate everybody and it doesn't really work, then actually what we're doing is creating a really quite serious problem for the future. So we need to look at all of this rationally and in a communitarian way. What's best for the community as well as the individual?
Now, Professor Gupta, you have obviously spoken at multiple forums. You've been a part of so many talks, panel discussion. I'd like to know what role do you think scientists play in, engaging with society? How important is it for scientists to take efforts and turn up at public engagement platforms? And why don't we see more researchers interacting with the public, especially in the STEM ecosystem? Why is there a gap between science and society?
Well, they're slightly different questions. I think there has been quite an increase in the visibility of scientists. Certainly in this country, there's a huge appetite for literary festivals to have panels of scientists and discussions around science, and books on popular science sell very, very well indeed. And many of those are extremely informative and good. And I wish I had had such a rich range of popular science to choose from when I was at school. So all of that is very good, but it's a there are also some quite serious gaps. I think that a lot of the popular science is directed at a level, where it's just about understanding certain facts or certain, concepts, that there is a tendency, again, it is somewhat market driven. So I think when something becomes market driven, there's a place for the market, so that and I think that place has been very nicely filled by a set of books and people, sort of celebrity scientists who are regularly sort of on TV and waxing lyrical about this and that. But I think there is an area where sort of the more nuanced philosophical scientific discourse is not really served at the moment that well. Sort of harder concepts or philosophical issues about which people used to write, that area seems to is undergoing a certain level of neglect. With regard to, obviously it's great for people to appear on panels and answer questions and it's part of, as you say, engagement with the public. But I also don't think, you know, I think that I don't think scientists should feel obliged to do it, you know, because it's not, some people don't like it, you know, some people like to quietly just go about their science. Other people are too keen on it. So again, in this sort of coronavirus, the Twitter sphere is full of people who find it extremely, you know, who are really turned on by being able to see their names in the papers and all that. So there are a lot of media hungry scientists who I think don't do us any favors. So there needs to be sort of balance. And also one thing that shouldn't happen is people shouldn't be judged by how much time they spend on public engagement. I mean, I like it. You know, I think it's always, it's something that I feel comfortable doing. And, you know, I hope that people benefit from my engagement with it. But it's something I consider to be part of what I do, and I like doing it. But I don't think it should be something that everyone feels they have to do, or that they should be judged by it. And again, there's sort of emphasis now. Every grant application you write, you have to say what your plan is to communicate something. I mean, some things in science you just can't communicate. So I think the communication of science is important. Part of it must be mediated through the market, but the market should not come to bear upon science and to say, you have to communicate this, otherwise, why are we paying your salary?
Right. No, that does, you know, that definitely is a very interesting point, that do scientists need to feel obligated to appear in front of larger audiences, or some of them might not be comfortable with it. So that definitely is an interesting point. I think we will start taking in some questions from the
okay,
audience.
I do have a very hard stop at 3:30.
Yeah, absolutely. We will wind this up and we just take a few questions. And we have received one question saying, what would your message to young girls in India be as to those who want to pursue science ahead? What would your message to them be?
So I'm not the person to give messages per se, but I mean, my experience being a young girl in India and being interested in science was, I think, a more positive one than many girls enjoy even now in the West. So I had a lot of support from, I mean, there wasn't a sense in the 70s in Calcutta that science was not something that a woman's mind should entertain. So I hope that climate prevails and has been maintained and maybe spread to all reaches. And if you are in an environment where someone thinks it's not something a woman should do, you just have to believe in yourself that it is. And life isn't always easy and simple. So it might be a rough journey, but it's always worth it.
Right. I think, like you said, just have that faith in yourself and it will work out. The next question is, what do you think can replace the current capitalistic nature of funding in science?
What do I think? What
do you think can replace the current capitalistic nature of funding in science?
Well, we could go back to, I think it should be much more government funded. I think that the funding should be placed back. The control of what science happens and the distribution of funds should come from the government, should be done centrally. And that's something that's been lost with the growth of foundations and charities. I'm sure they all have good mechanisms for making the funding happen. I mean, distributing the funding, but it does create that sort of capitalistic environment where everyone is vying for funding. The other thing that's important is for the world to sit up and remember that the market is not the best place, is not the best mechanism to foster technology. By technology, I mean advances in science. So advances in science are not, cannot be market driven, or aren't always market driven. Sometimes they are. So it's important for us to regroup as a society, as an international society, to try and fund science in a way that actually leaves more room for scientists to do science, to be judged on the basis of their science, and to have ambitions that are linked to science rather than to how much money they're bringing in.
I think that was very well answered, Professor Gupta. I'm sure our attendee has the answer of what they were looking for. And I think with that, that brings us to the end of this interview. Thank you so much for your time. I know you are very, very busy, but you still took out an hour to be a part of our festival. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And I'm sure our attendees have been inspired to pursue science ahead, to think of dabbling in multiple spheres like science, literature, public health, so on and so forth. Thank you so much, Professor Gupta. It was an absolute honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me, and good luck with the rest of the festival.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
To all of our attendees, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you all enjoyed this session as much as we did. We have a lot of events lined up for the rest of the month. Like I mentioned before, we have talks, panel discussions, workshops, demonstrations, games, and a lot of exciting prizes lined up for you across the entire month. You should participate in our social media competitions. You can tell us what you like about our sessions on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Tag us and tell us what you like best about these sessions. And we'll make sure that the best post, the best tweet comes to light. And we'll be giving exciting prizes to the best tweet. And we also want you all to know that you can register on our website. We have multiple talks going on. All you have to do is head over to our website, tick a box on the event that you're interested in, and just say that you want to attend it. And we'll be sending you calendar invites for the same. So it'll be on your calendar and you won't miss the event. Make sure that you register for all our games and keep celebrating science with us. Be a part of this revolution of bringing science and society together, because India Science Festival is here to bring the voice of science to you. So thank you so much for joining me. Do stay tuned for all our events in the month and have a great night ahead. Thank you. Bye-bye.